Stop whining. It's already sold. The kid behind the glass said it like he was reading a weather report. Bored with my grief, the bell above the pawn shop door still jingled behind me, a silly sound for a day like this. I steadied my breath and curled my fingers around the counter edge so he wouldn't see them shake. My name is Margaret Lawson, I told him, because I needed to hear my own voice hold steady. I'm 72, and that watch belonged to my husband. He died 6 months ago. I tapped the empty space on my wrist, the pale band of skin where life used to sit and tick. It's not just a watch. He shrugged toward the back, toward a manager who wouldn't meet my eyes. The hum of the cases, the bright tray of rings, the cold smell of penny metal. Everything felt mean and fluorescent. I pictured Edward's steady hands fastening their Rolex on Sunday mornings, the way he'd wink like the ritual was our private joke. He said a clock tells time. A watch keeps promises. Who sold it? I asked. The kid checked a screen and said a first name I knew too well. My son's, a second name, 2, his wife's, for effect, as if he were laying cards on green felt. My ears rang. My knees didn't buckle. They locked. I realized I wasn't hoarding tears. I was hoarding air. Ma'am, he said, softer now. Do you want the receipt number? I nodded once. I wanted more than a number. I wanted my promise back. Outside, January wind pushed against the shop front like it had a grudge. I stood under the awning with the receipt warming in my glove and watched my breath blow white. The parking lot was a rattle of shopping carts and salt-stained sedans. My Buick looked older than I felt, which is a particular kind of insult when you're past 70. I sat, shut the door, and let the heater cough itself into life. The number on the slip was the same kind of number banks use to make people feel small. I traced it with my thumb. Brian had signed neat and tidy, as if neatness could turn betrayal into paperwork. Tara's name sat beneath his like an echo that wanted to be a headline. I didn't cry. I pressed the slip to the steering wheel and listened to the engine hum. The world didn't tilt. It clicked, like a gear finding its teeth. The shop had given me a buyer code. 4 our records, the kid had said. I knew what records meant. I'd kept them for decades, when I ran a branch that smelled like toner and winter coats. Records were trails. Trails led somewhere if you walked them long enough and didn't lie to yourself about the blisters. I called Brian first. It went to voicemail. His greeting was cheerful. The same one he'd recorded when he still called me twice a week to ask about Edward's garden tomatoes. I hung up before the beep. I knew if I heard my own voice leave a message, it would carry something I couldn't take back. I drove, not home, not yet. The streetlights blinked awake early, and the sky looked like dishwater, the kind you leave to cool when you're too tired to finish. I turned onto the road that ran behind St. Luke's and watched a woman in blue scrubs push a wheelchair across the salt-crusted sidewalk. Good people doing good work. The thought steadied me. At a stoplight. I lifted my wrist, empty, light, wrong, and felt a stubborn little heat rise under the skin. Edward had worn that watch the day we signed our mortgage, the day Brian was born, the day we scattered my sister's ashes over the lake. He'd worn it the morning he told me, in the quiet kitchen, that he'd put protections in place, just in case. He'd smiled then, not smug, not secretive, only careful. The light turned green. I went home to see what he'd left me besides the ache. The house held its breath when I unlocked the door. Old wood does that. It learns your steps. I switched on the hall lamp and followed the yellow spill into the living room. Edward's reading chair faced the window like it always had. Polite, as if it were still saving his place. I set my purse down and took off my gloves with the same slow care I used when I folded his sweaters after the funeral. Ordinary motions felt like prayers after you run out of the formal kind. I walked straight to the mantel. The photo of our 50th anniversary sat in the middle, Edward's tie a little crooked, my lipstick too bold because Emily had picked the shade. A shadow of myself stared back from the glass. I reached behind the frame and found the thin metal key taped to the backing. Not a secret, exactly. A promise fulfilled on time. In the bedroom closet, a lockbox waited where it had always waited, plain as a lunch pail. The key fit like it had been rehearsing. Inside lay documents we'd reviewed together when the chemo started. Insurance, the will, the mortgage release. Beneath those, an envelope with my name in his careful caps. I sat on the bed and broke the seal. "Margaret," the note began, and I could hear his voice in the economy of the strokes. He wrote about the watch first. Of course he did. How the caseback had been serviced years ago by a friend who owed him a favor. How a harmless set of numbers was engraved there for me and only me. He told me once that a little secrecy keeps a marriage safe from storms. I had nodded, not understanding I would someday need a map drawn in a language only love could teach. The numbers were there, a sequence that meant nothing unless you'd memorize the last 6 digits of a safe deposit box 2 towns over. I had, because he'd asked me to, because I had made a list of everything worth remembering when forgetting began to feel like treason. I drove again, this time with a steadier hand, the box key in my pocket and the note folded like a small animal in my purse. The bank lobby was quiet, all carpet and confidence. The vault manager recognized me and didn't make small talk. I signed the card and stepped into a room that smelled like unperfumed soap. The box slid onto the table with a well-behaved thud. Inside was a flash drive in a zipper pouch, a folded ledger, and a photograph of Edward at the lake, grinning as if he'd just landed a fish. Though the hook was empty, I held the picture a long moment before I let the ledger claim my attention. Numbers are honest. They don't apologize. These told me that my son had not only sold a watch. He had been practicing on smaller promises for years. I stayed in the vault room longer than the manager probably liked, though no one hurried me. The ledger was handwritten. Edward's script angled and deliberate, the way he used to write grocery lists like they were business memos. Line after line traced transfers, dates, and account names that sounded more like shadows than banks. When I plugged the flash drive into my laptop later that evening, the shadows took on weight. Offshore accounts, wire receipts, balances that made my pulse stutter. Nearly $3 million tucked away where even I hadn't known to look. Edward had been careful, not sneaky, not selfish, protective. Each line carried the kind of foresight I once scolded him for. "You worry too much, Ed," I'd said years ago, when he insisted we keep a separate savings account apart from the retirement plan. He hadn't worried too much. He'd worried just enough to keep me safe when our son grew into a man who could no longer be trusted. I printed copies, spread them across the kitchen table, and studied them like I had studied mortgages and loan documents back in my banking days. There was order here, not chaos. He had built a shield, and now I needed to learn how to use it. I thought of Brian as a boy, running barefoot through the yard, the way he'd begged Edward to let him try on the watch. "Too heavy for you," Edward had laughed, tapping the boy's wrist. Somewhere along the way, heavy had turned into hungry. The debts I found, sports betting sites, payday loans in his name, even one in Tara's, were like rot blooming under paint. I couldn't face all of it alone. So the next morning, I dialed a number I hadn't used since Edward's illness. Detective Harris had once helped Edward's firm track a fraud case. When he picked up, his voice was the same gravelly patience I remembered. I explained enough to make him whistle low. He agreed to meet that afternoon, no promises, but his tone told me he was already leaning into the hunt. I closed the laptop and looked at Edward's chair again. "You left me the map," I whispered. "Now I have to follow it." And for the first time since the pawn shop, I felt something stronger than grief. Resolve sat down in the empty seat across from me. Detective Harris arrived wearing the same gray coat that looked like it had been part of him since the 70s. He carried a legal pad, not a tablet, and that comforted me. He took notes with a pencil that scratched like sandpaper against the page. I laid out the ledger and the flash drive's printouts, careful not to let my hands tremble. "This is thorough," he said after a long silence. "Too thorough for a hobby. Your husband planned this." I nodded. "He planned for Brian." Harris leaned back, the chair protesting under his weight. "Your son's been on my radar before. Minor stuff. Mostly bookies in Cincinnati. Some questionable associates. Nothing that sticks unless someone close to him speaks up." The words cut and soothed at once. Close to him. That had been me. Once. Now I was the witness he needed. I told Harris about the pawn shop, the receipt with Brian's neat signature. I told him about the debts I'd uncovered and the whispers I'd overheard at family dinners. Tara pressing him to get serious about inheritance. Harris didn't flinch. He wrote faster. When I finished, he slid the pad aside. "Here's the problem. If he's planning to declare you incompetent, he'll need a lawyer and a doctor willing to play along. Those don't come cheap. He'll find them, though. Greed pays up front." The thought made my stomach tighten. So what do I do? Document everything. Keep recordings if you can. I'll pull financial records. See what he's moving and where. But Margaret, he paused, choosing the word like it mattered. "You have to be ready when he comes knocking. Don't let sympathy trip you." Sympathy. I thought of Brian's first steps, his graduation, the day he carried Emily, red and new, into my arms. Sympathy was stitched into my bones. But Harris was right. If I stumbled, I wouldn't just lose money. I'd lose myself. When he left, the house felt heavier, like it knew a storm was circling. I brewed coffee I didn't need and sat by the window, watching bare branches claw at the sky. Edward had left me a map, but now the terrain was shifting. The son I'd raised was walking toward me with papers sharp enough to cut, and I would need more than grief to stop him. The knock on the door came earlier than I expected. It wasn't timid. It was a lawyer's knock. 3 sharp raps that said business, not family. When I opened it, Brian stood there in a pressed shirt he wouldn't have ironed himself. Tara beside him in a blazer too stiff for our neighborhood. Behind them, a man with a briefcase and a smile that didn't belong in any living room I'd ever cleaned. "Mom," Brian said, the words sliding out like he had rehearsed it. "We need to talk about next steps." I let them in. My heart thudded steady but not fast. Harris's warning echoed in my ears. I offered coffee out of habit, though none of them accepted. The lawyer opened his briefcase with a click that felt like a trigger. Papers spread across my dining table, the same table where Emily had once colored birthday cards for me with crayon streaks. "This is a power of attorney," the lawyer explained, tapping the top page. "Given your husband's passing, it would be wise to transfer certain responsibilities to your son. It's standard, keeps you protected." I sat, folded my hands, and tilted my head the way I used to with unruly bank clients. "Protected from what?" He smiled, patient. "From making mistakes." Brian leaned in, voice low, coaxing. Mom, you've been through so much. We just want to make sure things are stable. The word was a knife disguised as comfort. I let my eyes flick to Tara, who didn't meet them. Her gaze was fixed on the papers, like she could already see the numbers rearranging into vacations and handbags. I nodded slowly, stood, and walked to the sideboard where a silver dish sat beneath a lamp. Inside was a key. I held it up, then set it down again, deliberate. If stability is what you want, let's make sure everything is recorded properly. They didn't notice the tiny green light glowing on the bookshelf camera, my own device, not hidden, just part of the security system Harris had insisted I update. Every word, every gesture, every patient smile was being saved to a drive upstairs. When I finally looked back at Brian, I saw a flicker of nerves break through his polished calm. For the first time in months, the balance tilted my way. The next morning, I delivered the footage to Harris. He watched it twice, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. Each click of the lawyer's pen, each patronizing phrase, tightened his mouth into a hard line. "You played it right," he said finally. "You didn't argue. You didn't sign. You let them talk. That's evidence." I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath since the night before. Harris slid a folder across the table. Inside were records he had pulled, casino markers, wire transfers to offshore accounts not matching Edward's ledgers, a string of small businesses Brian had used as shells. He's in deep, and he's sloppy. Sloppy. That word used to describe a boy who tracked mud through the kitchen. Now it described a man who thought paper trails were invisible. Harris tapped one receipt. "This connects him to a tax fraud case the IRS is already sniffing around. If we feed them the right pieces, they'll bite." I closed the folder, the paper warm from my hands. "And the watch?" He hesitated. Funny thing about that, the buyer wasn't a stranger. Name came up flagged in a law enforcement database. Retired federal marshal. Goes by Marshal Keene. He reached out this morning, asked to meet, says your husband trusted him. The world tilted, then steadied. Edward's careful smile returned to me, the one he wore when he pretended not to have secrets. Maybe he hadn't trusted me with all of them. Maybe he trusted someone who could finish what he started. Harris scribbled a number. "Keene's expecting your call." "I'd take it." That evening, I dialed. A gravelly voice answered, calm and certain. "Mrs. Lawson? Edward told me you'd find me if the time came, and judging by the way his watch landed in my hands, I'd say the time is now." I gripped the phone tighter, pulse quickening. "What did he leave in it?" A pause, then a low chuckle. "Something small, something sharp. We should meet face to face." The line went quiet after that, but my living room seemed suddenly crowded with my husband's foresight, my son's betrayal, and the promise of a reckoning waiting just beyond tomorrow. Marshal Keene looked exactly the way his voice had promised, broad-shouldered, weathered, with the calm stillness of a man who had waited out storms before. We met at a diner off the interstate, the kind where the booths sag a little and the waitress calls everyone "Hun." He slid a small envelope across the table before I even ordered my coffee. Inside was a micro SD card no bigger than my fingernail. "Edward asked me to keep this safe until you were ready," Keene said, his tone more reassurance than explanation. "He figured the day might come when your own family would turn on you." My throat tightened. Edward had planned for betrayal, even when I couldn't imagine it. I looked at the tiny piece of plastic, light as air, heavy as truth. "What's on it?" I asked. "Bank records, signed affidavits, A couple recordings you'll want your lawyer to hear. Enough to make any judge think twice before handing over your rights. I pressed the envelope flat against the table. The waitress poured coffee, and for a moment it all felt absurd. Conspiracies and betrayals laid out between chipped mugs and sugar packets. But the absurdity didn't erase the power humming inside that envelope. Keen leaned closer. I'll walk you through how to use it, who to give it to, and when. But you need to decide. Are you protecting yourself only, or are you ready to see your son face charges? The question landed like a stone in my chest. My son. The boy who used to fall asleep with sticky hands from melted popsicles. The man who now signed my name on papers meant to erase me. I sipped my coffee to buy time. It was bitter. Thin. If he's willing to strip me of everything Edward and I built, then he's already chosen his side. I'll protect myself. And if that means he pays, then he pays. Keen gave a slow nod. Approval without judgment. Edward would have wanted you safe. That's all that matters now. When I left the diner, the envelope tucked deep in my purse, the winter air didn't sting as sharply. For the first time since the pawn shop, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing. The call came 2 days later. Harris's voice was brisk, carrying the rush of movement in the background. Margaret, it's happening. IRS agents are moving in. They've got enough from your files and Keen's card to open charges. You should be ready. I had copies of everything locked in my desk drawer. A lawyer on retainer who had reviewed the microSD contents and whistled low at the volume of proof. The house was quiet, but my chest was not. My heart beat steady, not from fear, but from something sharper, anticipation. The knock came at dusk. This time it wasn't polite. It was heavy, official, backed by the weight of government. When I opened the door, Brian's face was pale under the flashing lights of the black SUVs lining the curb. Tara clutched his arm like she could keep him upright. Agents moved past me with clipped voices and paperwork stamped with authority. Brian looked at me once, just once, and I saw the boy and the man collide. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words made it out before an agent guided him toward the waiting car. Tara's eyes were glassy, defiant, but her hands shook. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I stood in my doorway with the porch light burning above me and let the cold air sweep through. The neighborhood watched from drawn curtains, the way people do when justice parks on your street. When the cars pulled away, silence settled like snow. I closed the door and leaned against it, palms flat to the wood. Grief and relief tangled inside me until I couldn't tell which weighed more. Later, I called Emily. Her voice cracked when she answered. Grandma? Yes. Sweetheart. It's me. There was a pause, then a rush of words. I don't know what Dad did. I don't understand. But I don't want to lose you, too. Tears finally came, hot and unstoppable. You won't. You never will. We spoke until the house didn't feel so empty. She was 16, caught between loyalty and love, but she chose to reach for me. That choice mattered more than any ledger or court document. By the time I hung up, I knew what had to come next. Justice was done. Now healing had to begin. The week after Brian's arrest moved both too quickly and unbearably slow. Reporters called, neighbors whispered, and my lawyer advised me to keep my answers short. Yet inside the house, time softened, like the tick of Edward's watch echoing back after being silent too long. I retrieved the Rolex from Keen, who returned it with a firm handshake and eyes that promised I wasn't alone. When I slipped it onto my wrist again, the weight was both familiar and changed. It carried scars now, the way I did, but it still kept time with steady patience. One morning, Emily came over. She stood in the doorway, shoulders hunched under her school backpack, unsure if she was welcome. I opened my arms, and she walked into them like she had been holding her breath for years. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her father had once placed poisoned papers, and drank cocoa. She talked about college dreams, about wanting a fresh start, about missing her grandfather's quiet advice. I listened, my hand resting over hers, feeling the pulse of family still alive beneath the wreckage. Later that month, I signed papers to create a foundation in Edward's name, dedicated to children's oncology at St. Luke's. It felt right that his foresight would protect more than just me, that it would ripple outward, guarding strangers who needed shields of their own. On a Sunday, I stood on the porch, watch ticking steady, Emily beside me. "Grandma," she asked softly, "are you okay now?" I smiled, not with triumph, but with something steadier. "I'm not okay," I said. "I'm better. I'm free." And with the winter sun warming my face, I finally believed it.